How's it going, YouTube? Coming at you today with another video, and today, guys, what the bring to you is going to be the meta tier list for the new format. I'm feeling much better, so thank you all for the support. I've been absolutely sick for the last couple days. It was awful. Glad to be back now, and I'm joined by a good friend. Introduce yourself to everyone who hasn't already seen your channel.
Hello, my name is Megacaptialg. I've been a Yugi tuber since like Yugi tubing was a thing almost. And I'm here today to put together a tier list and to debate my good friend GGYGO.
There's definitely going to be a lot of interesting topics here, especially one that we'll save for the very end. So let's go ahead and hop into our first deck here, and that's going to be Flanders. How do you feel about this deck and its ability to compete this format?
I don't think Flanders is in that good of a spot. Nothing really changed all that much when I think about some of the decks that got hit, like Kashtira and Purrely and stuff like that. It just doesn't feel like it moves Flanders any higher. Like, they didn't have a great matchup against those decks, but even though those decks got weaker, I still don't feel like Flanders has that great of a matchup. I feel like maybe Striker might be kind of okay because that deck requires links and Impin can kind of shine against link decks, but overall, I don't really think it's that great.
So Flanders is definitely a deck that's been able to put up numbers for sure. Even if you're looking at the last YCS, it was in the top cut, which is still very surprising for a deck like this that can perform in a format where there's a lot of people on Droll. And I think that's really interesting, especially right now, because we're seeing a lot of people actually cut Droll. So I think that Flanders even goes to a little bit of a better spot. It's still a really risky pick whenever you want to play it, because you got to realize that you got to play the deck really well, but you still have the Empin, which is that skill drain, which is pretty cool. You have D-Shifter, you have Featherstorm. That card's really solid. For my own pick, I'd put Flanders in tier 2. I think that it's a really cool budget call if you're looking for something to play. I don't think that it's a bad deck in particular, but definitely learn your matchups and know exactly what you got to put up during the right situation.
I agree with that. Tier 2 seems about right. I think that there's a couple of tiers between that and the best.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's definitely going to be a couple that will end up putting in that wouldn't play tab too. But we'll talk about those when we get it. The next one here is going to be Plunder Patrol. Now, we can either call this Plunder or Runick Plunder. I know that Runick Plunder is getting a little bit more popular than just Plunder. A lot of different ways you can play this deck, though. For me, I've always said this deck was really strong as far as something where if you understood the deck and you know how to play, whether you're going first with the Adventure Engine or going second with Evenly and Kaijus, I think that both have a lot to say in this format as far as what they can do. I think this is another deck, though, that I would probably keep in that tier 2, just because we are seeing quite a bit of it. And with the Runick cards, I do feel like it kind of elevates it a little bit higher. But what do you think about this?
Okay, so Plunder's interesting, and I am kind of feeling a tier 2. I think Runick cards are just coming back because you're getting rid of a lot of those just gigantic negation boards that we saw from last format, and obviously like that kind of pushes Runick back kind of into the meta. I think it has some pretty good matchups against some of the upper echelon decks. Like against Kashtira, you've always been able to go into like Yord and give them a token, which can be really bad for them if they don't have Kashtira Birth. I think I underrated the Plunder Runick build initially, but I've seen it duel a couple of times, and I'm like, it's kind of okay. I'm kind of respecting it. A lot of tagging during your opponent's turn, a lot of drawing cards with Fountain plus Blackbeard and stuff like that, so I can dig it.
Yeah, you can pitch Whitebeard, kind of crazy. The next one that we have here, though, I'm going to let you open up with this one. It's Dino. We did just get new cards out of Wild Survivors, but what do you think about it?
Okay, so Dinosaur is interesting because this is a deck where if you would have asked me before, I would have probably put in wouldn't play. But I've seen some players like Denier Match. He's one of the highest rated players on Dueling Book. He's playing this deck right now, and people tend to forget that Dinos have still one of the best boss monsters in the game in UCT, but it is at its core a big combo deck. Like the boards that you can set up, especially if they go uninterrupted, or even if it's not that, an idle situation, but your opponent's hand trapping you and you have something like Miss, where it's like, doesn't matter how many hand traps you can throw at me. You can end on like Doka and Apolus and all of these different negates. I think it's stronger than people think. I think it's stronger than people think. I would have put it in like wouldn't play last format, but now I feel like it might be moving up a little bit.
So it's definitely an interesting deck, and I feel like if we have more Misk, then I
Hmm.
could definitely say like, yeah, like this is a really solid deck. But I think without having extra misc and having to play so many cards just to try to find it, because the combos I feel like it can be rather fragile. And there's still a lot of cards you need to see. I really like the fact that you have Lithosagem, because that card's insane.
It
But
is very fun.
yeah, that card's so clean. It's so wild. And when I saw it come back to 3, I was like, there's no way. But, you know, it's here. I personally would still put Dino at Wouldn't Play because I feel like there's just too many other decks out there that are just inherently better. But, I mean, it still doesn't mean that the deck doesn't have a lot to show for. This was a deck that also showcased Denglong back in the day. So I think that it has a lot of potential. I'm just yet to see it.
Okay. I feel like it's a deck to keep your eye on because I would say maybe Rogue, but I can understand wouldn't play until it's kind of proven something, until it has some type of history because it hasn't had anything competitively, noteworthy in a long time. I get that.
Yeah, it's kind of like when you sit down and you see that you're playing against Dino. I don't really know if you're exactly worried if you're playing like a lot of the heavier link decks that we have. Like,
Hmm.
yeah, UCT is a pretty crazy card as far as like Book of Moon. It can be pretty solid. You have a lot of the boards that you can set up. You have like Lost World. You have a lot of really cool cards in the deck, but I just don't know if it's there yet. And again, it doesn't mean that the deck is like bad. It just means that like if you were to tell me that I could play Dino, Runick Live Twin Sprite, Striker, Bystial Control, Dino is on the bottom of the list. Like I'm picking something else. So until we start seeing something that's crazier, it'd probably still be there for me.
Right, right, right. Okay.
So talking about Bystial Control, I think this deck's really solid. I didn't include Dragon Link. I just did Bystial Control because usually that's all we really see nowadays. I don't really think that I would play D-Link specifically. I think that Bystial Control has a lot that it can do right now. The past couple formats, it was really strong too. And I think that just having a ton of Bystials against some of the matchups, especially if people are still playing like a lot of Branded, you're going to have a really good time. I think that you do have a couple of really bad matchups in decks like Sun, which we could see a little bit more of as well, because I think that deck's really good too. But we'll have to wait and see. Bistro Control for me, though, although it is very strong, I do think that it might be getting a little too overhyped right now, and this is something that I would probably put in tier 2, just being another like mid-range control deck.
Yeah, I'm feeling somewhere around tier two as well. I've seen people kind of all over the place between Bestial Control and Dragons. Bestials are still very powerful. I like the fact that as they've gotten more cards, they're less reliant on the opponent's graveyard to kind of like play and oh, I have to hit a circular or something like that. And now it's more of I can just do things on my own. The issue is there are just going to be certain matchups like, Kashtira, for example, where, what are you doing to your opponent when they don't have any big dark monsters or light monsters and you're never getting that like additional value. So I feel like it's kind of in the middle. It can do some strong things and the synchro is crazy, but I don't think that it's better than like a lot of the decks out there.
Yeah, I would have to agree, and it's definitely something to also keep your eye on because it does have the potential to really pop up, especially if you get into like a heavy chaos format. Visual control is gonna be nuts, but right now, again, it's good, but I don't really know if it's the craziest. Like I know we have a couple decks already like below 1.5, but we'll hop into the higher decks soon. The next one that I have for us though is Sky Striker. Now I know that a lot of people are probably like, "Where are you gonna put this one at?" So I do like the deck right now. I think that it is very strong. Having 2 engage is definitely a huge upgrade to the deck. That's one thing where opening 2 engage or going like activate engage and then area 0 into second engage, like it just is crazy. It's wild that we get to do that again, honestly. I'm very excited for that. But I still think that Striker has some issues that are at its core level until we get everything back. Having 2 engage, I think that we'll start seeing a lot of very cool like engines being splashed together. I've already heard people talking about it. I've heard people talking about like Striker Draco, or if we see Harp come back, like Striker Orcust again. So definitely a couple things that I could see end up happening. I personally would probably put Striker at like tier 2. You could put it in like 1.5, but I don't really know if it's better than a lot of the decks that I'm about to put up in 1.5.
Okay, so this is ironic because I feel like this is our first kind of big disagreements, and I absolutely loathe Sky Striker. I really, really don't like this archetype. However, it's, in my opinion, it's absolutely crazy right now. The boards that people are making, whether it be Kashtira or, you know, other decks like some of the ones that we've already listed before, Flu, you know, Bestial Control, they're just not strong enough to withstand that many power spells that Striker can throw at you. Like, keep in mind, that deck has one of the strongest toolboxes in history, and Engage is very, very easy to get to. The triple tactics thrust and talents are absolutely insane now, and it really feels like Sky Striker is kind of, it's like a going second deck. There are so many powerful spells. There really isn't a strong floodgate that people are playing right now. Most of the duels that I've seen, Striker are just cracking boards left and right. You know what I mean? There doesn't really seem to be enough negations that people can throw up. So honestly, I feel like it's tier 1.5. And hot take, I won't be surprised if it does extremely well at an upcoming YCS. Like, I could see it even winning one. I think the grind game is also incredible.
Striker is definitely a deck of all time, right? It's one of those things where cracking a board never been a problem. I think right now the consensus is to side deck Annie spell, and that's definitely been an issue because if your opponent puts up like one negate and Annie spell, that's something that I've been running into a lot. That's a huge problem. And that makes me want to side deck cards like Kurakara as well, just to make sure that, you know, we can match up to the negation. Maybe playing like Phoenix some extra deck just to make sure that we have some way to out it. But at the same time, I definitely understand where you're coming from. And this is like one thing for me that should be like automatically 1.5 at least, right? But just from playing the deck a lot, I feel like you get into some awkward situations where some of the boards being put up, it might not be like the craziest board, but if you get interacted with a few times, it can be kind of awkward, especially if you can't like get to engage or you can't like get your spell count right away. So I'm definitely interested to see what it does, and I'm definitely still testing the deck, but just in my own personal opinion, I'd probably put it at like the highest rated tier 2, but I don't know if I could put it into 1.5 yet until I do some more testing to really see where the power level falls.
Fair enough. I just, the way that this format is looking, I just see too many powerful spell cards. Talents, Pot of Desires, Thrust to pull Engage from your deck. It just feels like if Striker breaks your board, there's very little coming back from it. And they're breaking boards right now.
Yeah, and I think it's really cool too because we're seeing like a lot of the Striker Runick and again just all these different kind of combination builds that I wouldn't be surprised if we started seeing Striker engines in quite a few decks. So we'll definitely have to wait and see where that falls as well. Talking about Runick cards, and probably in my opinion the best deck of the format is Live Twin Runick Sprite. I think this deck's crazy. Now, just because of the fact that you have a lot of points of interactions. Now, this is my favorite part about running any deck that has multiple engines and why I really like pile format, is because there's only so many things that you can, like, Ash, right? There's only so many things that you can imperm. And at that point, you gotta pick and choose. Like, if your opponent goes gigantic, then you're like, alright, cool, gotta Ash it. Then your opponent goes like, activate Hugin, search Runick Fountain, activate Fountain, pitch a card, draw cards. Like, there's too much to interact with. So either you're trying to go second and like break the board, or set up your own so you can at least like get rid of Fountain or like stop them in their tracks. So that's why I think this is the best deck of the format, just because of the fact that there's so much the deck does, and there's also like so many ways to draw. So you're always seeing like your side cards and whatnot too. So I think the deck's very good. But what do you think?
I'm with you on this one. This is a deck that I think I underrated going into this format. I played against a buddy of mine yesterday actually, and I was hitting him with things like anti-spell because I'm like, oh man, that'll shut down the Runick cards. And then it's like, oh, well, now I'm getting hit with Leela and I have to stop this, or that's going to start the Live Twin stuff, or he would start, or he'd chain Sprite starter, and it's like, okay, well, that gets blue, and then that gets jet, and you can go from there. So yeah, there's a lot of ways that this deck can attack you, and it's very difficult to answer all of them because the three kind of components that make this deck up with Runick, the Live Twins, and Sprite all are fairly different. And I think the grind game is it's very underrated. For instance, one thing that I found very difficult when dueling against him is he would have like a Sprite red on field, and then he would have like the two twins. And anytime I tried to do anything, he would tribute a twin, and then if I tried to do something else, he would revive like Leela to pop a card. And it's like, well, man, that's two disruptions for free every single turn. You know what I mean? And he doesn't have to put any more resources on the field or use any Runick cards to keep doing those two disruptions, let alone if he gets more Runick draws. And the Runick engine itself is very difficult to stop in game one. So I'm not sure about it being the best deck of the format, but I do think that it's fair to put it in tier one.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those decks that just does too much, and I think that's something where a lot of people were expecting a heavier Runick hit, especially with a format reset. So I'm very surprised we didn't see a bigger hit. I was expecting like Hugin to one. That would have been pretty impactful. But beside that, I do think that it is very strong right now. And looking at a deck that, honestly, last format was never the play, and that's Dark World. Because if you're going to get hit with Droll, it's going to be a rough time. But I think right now, it probably would still be in the wouldn't play category for me. But it definitely could be like in Rogue as well. Just because it's one of those decks where if you don't have a hand trap and you're playing as Dark World, you're sitting there like, well, it's just like, this is unfortunate because you already know, like you know exactly what's about to happen. So I think it's one of those pretty scary decks, but it's almost the same thing as like Dino, right? It's like if you have a board and they go like normal OV and they go effect and then you negate it and they chain misc, you're like, well, like it's kind of the same thing. So the reason why I would put this in like a wouldn't play category would be because I think that the deck has a lot of ways that it can like cheese your opponent, and I don't really like decks that are just like cheese, right? I don't think those are very good, very gimmicky. But I don't know. I think that it could be fine like in Rogue, but it would probably still be like a wouldn't play situation for me.
So I think Dark World's probably worse than Dinosaurs, and I also wouldn't play this deck. I would put it in the wouldn't play. I thought for a second, okay, maybe it could be Rogue because Droll is losing popularity in the main deck, and getting Drolled was just an auto loss last format for Dark World. I mean, it's just an auto loss at any time. But the thing about it is, there's still a lot of shifter going around. Like even if you play against Kashtira, you're probably gonna see shifter. If you're playing against Fluanderies, you're going to see shifter. There's a lot of like these rogue decks that can play shifter. That's pretty much just an auto loss. And then the issue with Dark World is like if you go second, you have to push with pretty much all engine. And that's just difficult because if your opponent makes a pretty strong board, like you kind of get wrecked. It's very difficult for you to deal with like Runick cards, especially if they banish like your Dark Worlds and stuff. I don't really think the deck's in a significantly better spot, even with Droll not as prominent in this format, just because it's too difficult going second because you can't run a bunch of hand traps, and there's still just going to be silver bullets against your deck. You activate a danger, your opponent chains shifter, and it's like, all right, well, go next.
Yeah, it's definitely a rough one. And the deck itself, it's just not that strong. I think that again, it's very cheesy, like going first and be like, I'm gonna rip your hand away. But then like going second, like you're saying too, it's so rough. So I definitely wouldn't. One deck though that can go second very well is Drytron. How do you feel about this deck?
Drytron has been in like a playable position ever since they got 3 Ben 10 back, and I believe it was Herald of the Arclight that they just got back. Am I right?
Orange
To
Light.
2? Orange Light, excuse me. They got Herald of the Orange Light to 2. So in theory, it should be in a little better of a position. I just I still look at Drytron and I still wonder, are they going to be able to handle some of the spell decks? Because I feel like Drytron versus Runick cards, not in a like very favorable position, or against a deck like Sky Striker, it's like, man, you really, really have to kill them because cards like Widow, or not Widowmaker, but Shark Cannon are just gonna be a nightmare for you. Your opponent's just gonna banish
Yeah.
a lot of your stuff. So I don't know. I honestly think Drytron's probably in like a roguish position until it like really proves to me. It feels like a much better version of something like Dark World or Dinosaurs, where it still feels kind of gimmicky, but like I guess a little more consistent.
Yeah, I've definitely like wiped an entire Drytron board. Went engage, Shark Cannon, banish, Kagari at back, banish, end phase, roll, set, banish. Like you just get rid of everything, and it's definitely rough at that point too. So I can definitely agree with being rogue. I think the
That's what
deck.
you feel too.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that the deck itself is pretty okay, but again, it's one of those decks that needs a good pilot. And
Yeah.
you got to really be concerned about quite a bit. So, a lot of cheese wins out of this one too, but I do agree that it's a lot better than both the wooden plays. So, we'll put it in Rogue. Now, this deck, I think because of Gamma being at 1, like actually hurt Tri-Brigade quite a
Mm.
bit, because if you look at builds that I think were the best with like Rescue Cat,
Yeah.
being able to go Rescue Cat effect with the Gamma in hand was crazy. And if your opponent like had to ash you because you're gonna get too much advantage, and then you Gamma, you definitely won right there, you know. So I don't know. For me, without even thinking about it too much, I'm probably just throwing this in wouldn't play. If we're talking about like Tri-Brigade Sprite, you could probably put it in Rogue, but I also think that's like the worst variant of it. So I would still put it in like wouldn't play, because if you're telling me to play Sprite cards, I'm probably just playing Live Twin Runick Sprite. But I don't like the deck right now.
Yeah, I was actually going to say the same exact thing. I actually think that the sprite build makes it kind of worse. To be honest, I've seen a YCS champion duel with the deck, and it seemed terrible. It was this format too. I think the inboard's not that great. Revolt's still a crazy card, but it just doesn't feel as powerful as it did before. And the pure builds are just too fragile. Like the pure builds are too fragile. The Sprite builds are by far like the worst versions of Sprite, and also they get kind of bricky, especially when you start throwing in like nimble cards. Like, man, you have so many different normal summons, and it's just kind of a mess. I wouldn't play this deck. Like, even I'm looking at things like Drytron. No, I wouldn't play this deck like at all.
You know, Revol isn't a super factorial, so
Yeah.
definitely got a little power creep there too. It's a lot easier to access. But we'll talk about that deck here in a little bit. It did just get hurt, so we'll mention it. But the next one here is actually one that I think is very underrated, and that's Sword Soul. I think Sword Soul with a new Denglong addition to the deck, there's a lot of cool things that the deck can do. Overall, I think in an undefined format, Sword Soul cleans up. Just because there's a lot of different things that you can really do with the deck right now. There's a lot of different combos. It's kind of funny because a lot of the combos, whenever I bring up Denglong, it makes me think of Dino, as far as like the different things that you can do. But like Sword Soul, it definitely has a lot of ways that it can play. It has a lot of ways that you can gain advantage. I was saying initially this is like one of the best decks of the format, like top 5. So I see you shaking your head no. My opinion's kind of like going a little bit lower now on that, just because of the fact that like I've seen it play new format and I'm not a fan. I'm probably still putting it at tier 2 because like I respect Sword Soul as a deck. But what do you think about it?
I think Sword Soul is this is ironic. I feel like it's basically been at the same power for like the last year, right? Like Sword Soul is the definition of if you feel like you're a good pilot and you can kind of outskill your opponent, it's a solid pick. The damage threshold and ceiling of Sword Soul is one of the highest in the game. This deck can kill you pretty much always because it has burn cards and the synchros are really big damage cards. However, the inboard of it is not that impressive. I mean, you have inboards where if you lose your Shijao, then you know your other cards like Blackout potentially can get turned off. It kind of feels like it loses to a lot of hand traps. Like if you go risky, you can lose to things like Nib, even if that's not that popular. And I don't know. I don't feel like it got any better. I understand that like Denlong is a thing and you play like 9 pillars, but then unfortunately you're adding like bricks into your deck. You know,
Yeah.
these are not cards that you want to the Yang Zings, the Nine Pillar. You don't want to draw. You don't really want to open with these cards. You kind of just want to like search them and have the Denlong facilitate them. So even though it did get more cards by I guess the way of the FNL list, I feel like it's in the same exact position that it's been for like the last couple of years. I mean, you will see players get a top 16 or a top 32 here and there or top regional, but like consistently, it's I don't think Sword Soul has a snowball's chance of like winning a major event.
So like the typical end board of Sword Soul is Baron, Chi Blackout. You know what breaks that?
What's that?
Burner, Chain Anchor.
There you go. I mean, that's what I'm saying. And like you lose Shizhao, and then your blackout is also gone. And it's like you can't, you just can't win that type of game. You know what I mean? Like its inboard is just not powerful enough. Like even though you could count that as three disruptions, man, a lot of times I'd rather just have an Arise Heart. Seriously.
Yeah.
I'd rather just have a walking macrocosmos who can get a billion materials. Yeah, Sword Soul is fine. It's just I think it's been kind of in the same position, and I think the more people play at this format, the more they'll realize it's not as powerful as they think.
Yeah, I definitely think that in an undefined format where like nobody really knows what to do, especially if you played it before, it's probably a really solid pick. But once the format gets a lot more defined, it's probably going to be losing a lot of gas.
The earlier the format, the better Sword Soul is because again, it knows what it wants to do, and it's one of the decks that can kill you so relatively easily.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And another deck that I feel can definitely do a lot, right? Like this deck is kind of crazy. That's Sun Avalon Rika. Now, this deck alone, I think, is one of the decks that nobody even knows what it does yet, and it's been out forever. And, this deck is probably one of the craziest in terms of power level and ceiling, because, like, plant cards in general have always been pretty crazy. And now we get this deck that you have Con, which tributes your opponent's monsters off for your effects. So, like, Ricochet, tribute 1, steal 1. Like, that's already insane. And just a lot of ways to grind, and then you have Princess, which shuffles back for cost. So, like, GG's on that one. If you want to banish it or something, you have to do it, like, preemptively. So definitely a lot of cool things. Me personally, I would put this deck in 1.5. I think this deck's crazy. I think that you definitely need to play this deck for like a while before you take it to a tournament. But I think in terms of payoff, not only are you going to catch a lot of people off guard because no one knows what the deck does, you're also just going to be able to win a lot of games because not only can this deck play going first instead of a crazy board, it can definitely go second and break a board.
Yeah, I'm also feeling 1.5. I feel like Rika is probably going to be one of the most underappreciated decks, or it's going to be one of those decks that no one really expects. And I don't know if you saw like the UK Nationals, but the girl Jessica Robinson went like, completely undefeated in Swiss and just I think she made top 4. The deck is very strong. I would say I'm a big fan of combo decks that can like easily play through Nibiru. And this deck can because they can just kind of negate it using some of their Rika cards. Tributing your opponent's stuff as a cost is one of the best. Actually, it's the best disruption in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! And so few decks can actually do it. No deck can do it as well as Rika. You can actually play some floodgates in the deck. Like you can main deck Rivalry, which is awesome because people are so focused on you tributing their stuff and you having like monster negations. And then it's like, how do you also deal with the Rivalry? And one of the biggest cards that counters this deck is really just not being played. And I think that's Evenly Match. Evenly Match is really crazy and it can super mess up their board because they're either going to lose all their monsters or they're going to lose Con and their ability to tribute your stuff. But people just aren't playing evenly, which means a lot of times like you have to just try to force through their board and it's very, very difficult. Things like Dark Ruler aren't that good against it because they tribute from the graveyard or they'll activate Sheet, which is a trap card. So yeah, I think Rika is actually really crazy and they can play a bunch of hand traps too.
Yeah, it's one of those decks too that you play against it and you really got to understand the interactions and read every card because there's so many things that the board ends up on. There's so many ways that it can like play back into you. There's cards in the graveyard that you can banish and resummon like other cards. Like the deck's crazy. I love this deck. Talking about another deck though that I feel like is relatively underexplored is going to be Manadome. I feel like a lot of people are like playing the deck, but there's nothing like new happening, right? Like we saw like Manadome Yang Zing, which is like pretty cool. I think that's cool. At the same time, it's like kind of not as good because, like you said earlier, you're adding a lot of bricks to your deck that you don't really want to see. But at the same time, it's like kind of fine if you have a lot of ways to Vasas. And then the deck just loses to so many hand traps. So
Yeah.
I don't really know where I'd want to put this. I think that like if I put Monodome anywhere, it's probably glued to Sword Soul because I feel like they're relatively the same deck. I think Sword Soul's a bit more consistent, to be honest. But I think that wherever I put Sword Soul, I'd probably put Monodome.
Okay, so I've thought about this, and I've been saying for quite some time it's literally the same deck as Sword Soul. I think Sword Soul is just better because it's more consistent. It really feels like Monodome takes two cards to do anything, and even though they can do a lot of stuff if they go uninterrupted. I've seen some absolutely crazy combos. I love their fusion monster, the vicious that you can kind of just summon for free, and you can do cool things with cross sheep. But there's just so many points to disrupt this deck. I mean, it's like one of those decks where if you get drolled on any of your 5 billion searches, you are probably just passing turn. You no longer have the element of, well, I got the gamma. That's pretty much like not gonna happen. And even when they do kind of full combo, it feels like they're just ending on like Baron plus another monster. So it
Yeah.
still feels very sword solely. It just feels sword solely with like infinitely more steps, and it feels like you're crushed by a lot more cards. To be honest, I think it's a rogue deck. I don't even think it's as good as Sword Soul because, like, if you've looked at the past couple of weeks, like this deck has been invisible. I,
Yeah.
yeah, I feel like it's slightly worse than Sword Soul, and I've been saying that it and Sword Soul are the same deck, but I think Sword Soul is more consistent.
Honestly, I kind of agree. Like, no, I know that some people are going to be like, but the Yang Zing cards are crazy, or like, I have the best build. But like, listen,
It breaks.
the deck isn't doing much. It's not very good. And then post Dune, I think the deck's insane. Post Dune, I think the deck's very, very good. Right now, though, there's so many other options. Like, you can play it and you could do stuff, but it's not that good right now.
Post Dune, it could theoretically become one of the better big combo decks in the meta game. But right now, it really feels like a deck that always needs two cards to combo. It feels like a lot of times if you draw like the little ones, unless you have, I don't know, like
Re-Empire.
yeah, unless you have one of those like the bigger ones, you can't really do anything. Again, Droll is crippling for this deck, and I know Droll's a little less popular, but there still may be people who are main decking it. And then I just don't really feel like the payoff is all that good. Your payoff is basically the same exact board as Sword Soul, but you don't get like the random burn damage. You don't get the ability to, oh, I have an open field. I can just OTK with like two cards. I just think it's a worse version of Sword Soul, honestly.
Yeah, no, it's definitely one of those decks that I thought was going to be absolutely bonkers, but like the more you play it, it's just like it's not
Not
really
that
that
good.
good.
It's not.
There's so many other decks that I played before that. I'd play Flanders before that deck, to be honest.
Yeah.
Just because you have so many more cards that are just inherently more broken. And that's kind of like the deck that I want to play right now, right? Like the most broken cards in one deck. Just because, and especially in a format like this, where like you were saying, the end boards aren't super crazy. Like you really
Oh,
just need those crazy cards to just get ahead. And I feel like, to be honest, this next deck, it has a lot of room for non-engine. I don't know how much you've played Marincess or looked at like different lists that have went up or like done well. There's been
mhm.
a couple during national seasons so far that have done very well. There's like the barrier statue lock, which of course another deck's gonna use another barrier statue once the win one's
I
gone,
know that
right?
combo. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I know that combo.
So I like this deck a lot. We just got the new card that you can pitch one out of your hand. It's basically like the Water Longyong, and I think that's really cool too because you can summon Gamir and Gamir's nuts. So you have like Argonaut, Gamir Wave, which is just like a crazy setup, and just like the ability to regain resources, I think is stellar in this deck. For me, I would probably put this in tier two. just because it's another one of those decks that's like protect the tower, but it's also very consistent. So like a part of me even wants to put it higher, just because I feel like this is another one of those decks that's like really underappreciated and like still very good. It's like last year when Elijah Green got fourth place with it, and everyone's like, "Whoa, that's a deck," and it's like, yeah, the deck's very good, and it's just very like a lot of people don't play it, and so they kind of write it off, but if you actually play the deck, you'll realize like how broken this deck can actually be. And I think that's really cool too, because you catch a lot of surprise factor like you would with Sun. So I think that it would probably be tied with Striker as far as like a really high end tier 2 deck, and it's also very budget. So if this is something that you want to try out, definitely go ahead and give it a shot and let me know down below how it works out for you. Just because I think the deck overall is very solid, but it's also like $30 for the whole deck, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah, so I think Marincess is probably like tier two. I think it's very similar, not in playstyle, but kind of like the positions as the Rika deck in terms of like people don't they know of the cards, but they don't really know of everything that the deck does. I feel like Nib is probably going to be a little less played this format, or at least early on, because there'll be like control decks that like Striker people like, oh, I don't want to run Nib against Striker, or these Runick decks, and that super benefits Marincess because they just want to go go go. Marincess has so many cool things that it can do, whether it's making Kraken and then flipping over something like Gozen Match and saying, just water monsters. You can make Toad, and I just feel like it's very consistent. Even if their inboard doesn't look like overwhelming, it does a good enough job. And usually, if they are able to just survive, like they can usually win. Even if you break their board and you don't like kill them, I know the Link 3 activates from the graveyard and
Yeah.
some monsters, and she's kind of crazy, but I think some of those utility cards that they have out of the extra deck like really catch people off guard. Like, you're like, oh, I didn't see my opponent, randomly going into Bahamut Shark Toad or making Stealth Kraken and then flipping over those, and I can't do anything against that. So yeah, I feel like Marincess is in a pretty good spot, maybe even an argument for best Cybers deck currently.
Yeah, no, I definitely like this deck a lot. There's a lot that you can do. Again, a lot of non-engine spots. It's probably like a good 20 spots on the deck that you can just play hand traps or whatever cards you want to play. So definitely something to check out. I think it's very good. Talking about a different deck here that honestly, I think that no one really expected the results this deck still puts up, and that's Tier. It did just get top 16 at Philly, and it has snuck into like every YCS that we've been a part of, which is kind of crazy. Like, yes, you have to like heavily RNG this deck now, which is kind of wild, but like the power is still kind of there. Like, if you start milling and you mill well, you might be winning that game. But like, there's still the games that you play and you don't mill well, and then you just lose. So I think that's kind of tough. You play against like Bystial control, one of your names get banished, now you're really in a bad position. So like, it's kind of hard for me to place this one because like what it's doing right now with the hits, it makes me want to put it higher, but I don't know if I can put it past tier 2.
Yeah, I am thinking Rogue. Now, I will say that I've been surprised that Tier has been able to, like, yeah, you look at YCS Philly, it puts a player in top 16 and you're like, how'd you do that? Tier can still when it goes off, you can still end on very, very strong boards of like Queen Rakalos and the Dark World fusion monster and then some other stuff. And it's like, man, that's a lot to potentially play through. You can have Planet still popping cards during your opponent's stuff or during your opponent's turn and shuffling back. But I played tier round one at Philly and I 2-0'd them with the quickness. It also feels like a deck where sometimes you will mill like 10 cards and hit no names, and that just doesn't feel great. I also think that DD Crow might be popping back up in popularity, which would be terrible for this deck. And I think it was Aurora Yu-Gi-Oh that said like playing tier right now is just literally gambling. Like seriously, it's just if you're that good with tier, man, go to Vegas. I don't like it's a powerful deck. I just think its consistency is terrible. I think its consistency is very, very poor right now. Like it to me, I don't know, man. I feel like I could probably get the same results out of something like Drytron. But I guess Tier might be able to go second a little better because you do have things like Havness and you have Fenrir and stuff like that. So you know what? I think maybe it's probably better than like something like Drytron, but I think it's a rogue deck, honestly.
Yeah, and I think this might be the one time where we truly disagree, besides like Striker. I think that this probably has to, at least in my opinion, tier two, just because I know that if I play some of these decks and my opponent goes Reveal Sharon, pitch a Guido, like it's still really crazy. Or like if they get a Shuffleback Engrave, there's still enough situations where I feel like that's just rough. Like that's just hard to deal with. Not to mention if they get Kaleido on board and they can set up a Solic, like that's still a pretty strong end board because that's just like what you're trying to go for kit anyways. So like it still can do things. So I'm definitely thinking too when we get the new like Revolution Synchron. I think that that's going to be really cool. Or when we get like Assault Synchron, that there's probably going to be a lot of really cool Purrely things that you can do with tier. So I'm gonna leave it at tier two. But I definitely can see the argument for like Rogue too, just because like it is a gamble. This deck is like a crazy gamble, but it's definitely still, I don't know, in my opinion, I would definitely play this before Monodome, you know?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, yeah, it's better than Monodome, and now that I think about it, it's better than Drytron. I just think the consistent, like the power is crazy, but I just can't get over the you have three names, and if you don't hit them, you just like aren't doing anything.
Definitely let us know down in the comments below where you'd put tier, because I feel like it's an interesting topic right now. There's a lot of different ways that it could go. Talking about the next one, though, I think this deck is very good. And historically, I have said that I will never play another trap deck ever again after I put down Guru. And now that Labyrinth is a like mid-range control because you're using all like the furniture and whatnot, I think that the deck is very good. I think that it's very, very good. There's a lot of different things that you can do. Being able to set a trap card turn one and use it is kind of crazy. I would put this in 1.5. Initially, I said this would probably be a tier 1 deck, but in my opinion, I feel like Ash Blossom being in the format and a lot of people switching to playing Bell, especially if you're playing Versus because people want to main it for an Earth reveal, I think that you're at a huge disadvantage when both of those cards are being in the main deck.
Okay, so I think Labyrinth is in an excellent spot. On the FNL list, all they really lost was Gamma, and that could be a little impactful, but for the most part, not so much. I feel like it is very similar in terms of like position in the hierarchy of everything as a deck like Rika. One of I think the biggest benefits of Labyrinth, and it is going to suck that people are bringing Ash back into like everything, and they're getting rid of like Droll, which didn't really do anything about against this deck. But one of the things I really like about Labyrinth is the virus cards are still just crazy.
Yeah.
And there are not a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh decks that can answer, in my opinion, like Runick and Striker cards, like these just powerful spell upon spell upon spell in game one. So it feels like these decks just kind of overwhelm the opponent, or you just get like a free game one win. Labyrinth isn't like that. It is not troll at all to play Eradicator in your main deck, and if you just happen to pull it out of your deck with like Lovely, you can just get a free win against them. That card is insane. It's not even troll to Eradicator like Kashtira turn one because they play a billion spells.
Yo.
I think Labyrinth has like a pretty even matchup against like everything. There's not a meta deck that I'm just like, it just destroys Labyrinth. Like Labyrinth's in a great position.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that whenever I put something in tier 1, it has to be like undisputed one of the best, if not the best deck in the format. So I think that it's really hard for me to like add things to that category. But as far as things in like 1.5, they're decks that I heavily respect, but they might be at a bit of a disadvantage. I think that the Gamma to 1 thing really does hurt Lab. I think that's unfortunate because that's the only way that you could really protect your welcomes from getting ashed or belled. So
Right.
that's a little unfortunate, but overall, I do think that this is a deck that is very scary. If I was sitting down playing Striker and my opponent goes activate Stovey, I'd be like, I'd be like, this is gonna be rough. This is not gonna be easy. So definitely one of those things where if you haven't already checked out IKEA, I would definitely look up some profiles, check it out, try it out, and let me know how it goes. Now this is a deck that I took to Philly, and I saw the ban list, and I was like, wow, that's great. But Mathmech now has one circular, which honestly sucks. But there's so many different ways too that you can like make a hybrid Cybers deck. I've been talking to a lot of people about the different things you can play. I don't, however, think that it really does help anything in the deck. Because the whole objective of it was to be really consistent, like see circular, search superfactorial, play the game and win, right? And now you can play like more addition. You like mandatory have to run through diameter. So you can go like normal diameter, summon addition, and then when you make Allen you have a negate, so you like for sure search the circular, which is like great. But I don't really love the deck right now after that hit, just because being able to open circular every hand and then also having circular on the crackback was nuts. Because, like, that's multiple bodies on the board immediately. Because now you use circular, but then when you're trying to play back in your opponent, all you have is like a Sigma engrave, normal summon diameter, and if you have like add or sub in hand, instead of just going like summon circular, summon Sigma, search equation, because like now you can't search both, which is
Right.
like more unfortunate. It definitely hurts for follow up. So I'm not a huge fan of Mathmech right now. Honestly, this kind of puts it to Rogue for me. I know that some people were still talking about it in like tier 2, but that hit hurt. I don't think that it was something that deck can really manage through, especially in some of the crazier decks right now.
Okay, so Mathmech is interesting because I thought it was obviously like last format in a fantastic spot. Outside of I guess like getting drilled and stuff like that. Even though I feel like there's a lot of ways to still get to circular, I feel like you're going like they were already running those ways, right? Like people were already running small world, they were already running, signet mining and stuff like that. And now it's like you have to put other stuff into your deck. If you put the firewall cards in, has a high payoff, but they're like they can be really bricky. And one of the issues that I've always kind of had with Mathmech is you can make Heat Soul, and that's really cool, but it feels like if you're not drawing hand traps, you're just drawing like all of these random Cybers cards and engine. Mathmech feels like it's in a position where like it's not kind of strong enough to go second and reliably like access cheese the opponent. And if you don't get circular or you don't end up on, super factorial plus your full board turn one, a lot of decks are just running you over. I don't really like this deck right now. Forget about like the Bystials because I've seen the deck honestly just lose the Bystials. You activate super factorial, they banish, diameter or something like that, and it's just like, okay, well now you don't really have that much. I think it's a rogue deck because I don't think it's a meta deck. I don't think there's any reason to honestly play it over something like Marincess, which is just going to be like more consistent and probably have a higher payoff right now, especially if there's a ton of nib in the format.
Yeah, because like the whole thing with going second and having circular in hand, right? It's just a free body that sends for cost. Like that is the craziest part about it, right? So
Hmm.
they're not gonna like negate the summon out of hand. And even if they do, you still get Sigma, which is nuts. And then you have things like Diameter that you can normal summon and go into combo. So I feel like taking away that free summon is really big. So can't really side with it going any higher than Rogue at the moment. And I know that someone's going to be like, hey, like the deck's still fine. But at this point, I feel like it's a little cope. It's a little cope. And I get it. Like when a Banlist hits and you're like, oh, the deck still lives. Like it's there for like 2 weeks, and you're like, all right, cool, we got to play a real deck now. Like, it definitely is unfortunate. And trust me, I love Mathmech. I love the deck so much. I brought it to Philly. I thought the deck was so much fun. But seeing Circular at 1, it definitely hurt. It was unfortunate. So the next deck that I have here is going to be Runick Naturia. Now, we did just see the hit to Sacred Tree to 1, which I feel like a lot of people were kind of like, whatever. But at the same time, if you ever played against Runick Naturia, sometimes when you ash the Sacred Tree, they just pass because they didn't hit their Naturia engine, which is kind of inconsistent to see. So if you don't see your Naturia engine, it's going to be rough. And now that you can't just keep going like Camilla dump Sacred Tree, add something to hand, which was like huge for the deck to do that all the time. I do feel like that did hurt quite a bit. Not saying the deck's like dead, but there's still a lot that did to the deck. So what do you think about it?
Okay, so I think this is probably like it obviously was really, really good. Although not good last format because Runic can struggle with big combo and like negations and stuff like that. But this deck got a crippling hit. I know, like before you could go Hugin and discard like the Runick card, the trap, and get like searches, and that was pretty consistent. Now it's limited, so that's probably just not gonna happen anymore. I do like elements, like if you can end on Naturia Beast, that seems really good right now. But going second just feels like it could be a struggle, and I think the consistency has just been wrecked. To be completely honest, like I don't think that there's a reason to play this build of Runick over something like the Live Twin Sprite build, where if you look at the individual pieces of those, you know, only thing that's really been hit recently is like starter to two. Like you still have all of those power cards around you,
Hit.
where yeah, like this one, you know, the Naturia engine like kind of got decimated. Like it's not able to go like all out like it did before. So it's not a deck that I would play. I feel like it's more of the kind of lesser end on the Runick side. So I think it's like a rogue deck to be honest. Like I've seen a couple of duels with it, and I'm like, man, that Baron Pass or those turns that they're doing just they don't look like they did a few months ago. You know, at like YCSLA.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with you on the whole not opening up Sacred Tree thing, because the Runic spell plus Sacred Tree meant that you were popping off. And then it gave your opponent the option between, like, do you ash the tree? Do you ash the fountain? Do you go after Hugin? Like, what do you do? But, like, now it's kind of like, man, I don't really have a good discard now besides, like, other Runic cards.
You don't really want to discard like real cards while playing, you know, a Runic deck, and that deck had like the ultimate of ultimate fodders, which was like one of the best things about it. But now you just don't have that anymore, or at
Yeah.
least not consistently.
No, I completely agree. And the deck itself, there's just no way that if I'm putting Runic cards in my deck, it's not Live Twin, you know? Like, it's just the better variant. So talking about another deck here, Kashtira. Now, I wonder if we're on the same page about this one. Because,
Yeah,
so, the way that I look at Kashtira right now, right? People were like, alright, the hit wasn't enough. But if you look at before this ban list, almost every player was saying as long as Diabolosis gets hit, it's okay. Like, the deck is
right.
going to be easy to play against. At least it'll be more manageable. And I agree. But now we got 2 Unicorn and we have 1 Arise Heart. I feel like that's pretty significant. Because of the fact that people were already playing Prosp and Desires in the deck. And I'm still seeing that. And so now you're risking banishing Unicorn face down and getting it gone forever if you don't recur it with like a Arise Heart, which is pretty crazy. And now you only have 1 Arise Heart as well, so like that's already pretty not great. The other thing too is like that's a huge consistency hit, because like if you can't see Unicorn in your opening 5, it's not really something that you want to be in a situation of, right? You can still go like Fenrir with like Rise Heart, but like realistically now you're either like have the extender and go into a Rise Heart by itself, and honestly, the second that a Rise Heart goes, it's gonna be a weird grind game. And the other thing too is like I've seen people try out different engines with the deck. I think that if I were to play it right now, it'd be like a Rise Heart and Floodgates, because I think that's
Right.
probably like the best way to run it. But what do you think?
So this one's really simple for me. Tier one. The Diabolos hit was very significant. I think the Arise one not as much. I heard that there was like a 700 person event that a person won with just one copy of Arise, and honestly, I like to me it still just comes down to the consistency of Kashtira is just it's insane. I completely understand what you're saying about like desires. I wouldn't even risk desires anymore because yeah, like if you banish, you know, a couple unicorns or one unicorn, like that can just be the end of the game. But when you're still talking about 3 pressure planet, terraforming, 2 hard copies of unicorn, and then you know Fenrir to also be able to you know search it and then dig for 6 with prospect, like it just feels like there's no way you're not going to see that card. And I still think right now in Yu-Gi-Oh, Unicorn is one of the most powerful monsters. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen maybe a turn 3 or a turn 4 where it's like, all right, this game can go either way. Oh, he top decked Unicorn into Birth, into Fenrir, into like kid, you know, dead, you're dead now. Like Kashtira has a huge damage threshold. It has a bunch of variety, or it has a bunch of ways that it can play. I don't think its extra deck is like all that good anymore. Like I do agree that losing Mind Hacker kind of took a lot of power from the extra deck. Now it just feels like Shangri-Era and Arise and like everything else is just kind of average. But I think it's a tier 1 deck. And honestly, I think the popularity will push it to tier 1. because I think that it's just going to have the numbers. If there was a YCS tomorrow or next weekend, I feel like I have no doubt in my mind that Kashtira would have like one, at least two in top 8, and then we can kind of go from there to see like how far it goes. But it's just gonna have the numbers. And I also think that very similarly to what I said about Striker and the runic cards and how difficult they are to counter, like in the early games, Cash can play those you can play those virus cards because they can make big dark monsters. But yeah, I think it's just gonna have the numbers, and the deck is like it's still just stupidly consistent.
Talking about another deck that just got absolutely destroyed by the ban list, which is kind of crazy because it just shifted the whole playstyle. Because now Purrely is just going second. Like, it was going first and put up Nor, now it's go second, set up Happy. I think this deck got hit very significantly. Like, that was wild. For me, though, I think that there's still enough the deck can do. I would probably put this at, like, tier 2. I don't think that's very good. I think that it's, like, fine as, like, a going second option, but there's just a lot of other decks that I'd play before this.
So, man, I have so many feelings about Purrely. Not even so much about where the deck currently stands, but about the travesty of what happened to it. And here, you're right. It lost its identity, or it has to completely pivot into either we're gonna go for like these happy cheese kind of OTKs, or we're gonna just try to like turbo Zeus, and hopefully, Big Zeus can just kind of get there. And those are, those are gonna get some wins. Man, I feel like I think I'd still probably play it over a lot of decks in Rogue, but I'd be kind of concerned if someone forced me to go first, especially after siding. So I think it is better than like the Rogue decks, but I think it's very linear now. And I feel like Noir is going to be something that you don't even really see that much, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I agree. Being a tier 2 deck now, I feel like if I were to play Purrely or like Bystial Control, I might pick Bystial Control or like Striker or Marincess. So definitely still would be in that range just because I feel like there's a lot of effect negation now in terms of like Ash, Veil, or Imperm being in the format. And a lot of those cards are pretty rough against this deck too. So we'll see.
Purely, I think when I'm looking at some of the other decks in tier 2, this could be a deck that honestly drops into Rogue, because I'm not quite sure it's going to have the support of the players, because Purely was already supposed to be like kind of a difficult deck to pilot, and I think this just makes it like infinitely worse from that perspective. So this is a deck that at the end of the format could easily be in Rogue, and could be a deck that like no one's playing.
Let's just move one up real fast talking about travesties. Uh, Super Heavy Samurai going from 1 card combos to 2 card combos. Definitely really crazy that this ban list dropped and kind of just hit the newer decks. Like we don't really see that besides like Pepe. Like that was like one other time.
In tier 0.
But like tier live longer than both of these decks, and I think that's a problem.
Yeah.
Like that's clearly an issue. And I don't know, I think Super Heavy does a lot of cool things now. I think that like they're just cool though, as far as like the different combos that you can do. I think that there's a lot that you can accomplish with the deck, but man, it's like some of the combos feel kind of cope. Like I feel like it's really not great into a lot of hand traps, especially Nib, because you don't have Gamma. So like that was a huge thing for this deck. I'm having a hard time placing this one, to be honest. I want to put it in tier 2. What do you think?
I think that's too high. I think there's actually a bunch of places you could put Super Heavy Samurai. Obviously, like I feel like it was definitely a super strong deck last format. Now they have to completely pivot their combo lines, and even though they can still end, like there's like a couple of 1 card combos that get them a lot. They're very, very specific. Like you said before, now things like Ash, they ditched the motorbike. You never really like Ash that before. You wouldn't droll then. Now people aren't scared to do that. They'll just Ash, they'll droll, and you might just be like, oh well, dang, I didn't expect that. I don't think a lot of people are going to play this deck. Its payoff is still okay, but it just feels like it needs a lot more resources, and that was just such a devastating hit. Like, if I'm being completely honest, I feel like this is like a Drytron level deck now. I feel like it's a deck that if it goes completely uninterrupted can do big combos. Um, Probably is gonna struggle to go second. Like, you'll have some hand traps. You'll have hands where you hand trap your opponent, but like it won't just be, well, I have Wakashi, so full combo and I kill you. Like, you're not gonna have that anymore. Like, that was the best thing about the deck, is it needed so little resources to do what it did, and now you just don't have that luxury anymore. And I don't think it's like better than Drytron or decks like Manadome anymore. I'm open to be proven wrong, but I don't really think that the big combo players are gonna play this deck. I think it's a rogue deck until proven otherwise.
So whenever I look at a tier list, I always look at the fact that I would play certain decks before other decks when I go about the tiers. So
Hmm.
for that reason, I would put this in tier 2, just because I would play this before Mathmech, I'd play it before Manadome, I'd play it before Naturia Runick. Maybe if I was more versed on Drytron, I'd play that first. But I think that there's still enough that the deck can do to where it warrants at least being at tier 2.
I hate to say, well, I don't even hate that. I think it's a dead deck walking. I think it's gonna fall on its face. I think it won't do anything crazy at Nats, and I think the big combo players who are looking to get their combo, they'll pick something else, or they'll just wait for Manadome after Dune.
That deck is going to be so much fun. That deck is going to be so crazy, because now you can play Crime and Solic again, and that's going to be a lot of fun. The next deck here, I really wish this deck would just go away finally, honestly. It's just so annoying. But branded, I mean, it's still branded. It still does branded things. It still activates branded fusion, you know? It's 1.5, in my opinion. I don't think it's, like, tier 1, but I think the power is still definitely there, but it still loses really hard to Ash. Like, a lot of people say that it doesn't because you can do other things, but like Ash on Branded Fusion at the end of the day still really hurts. Where would you place this deck?
I am almost in complete agreement. It feels, to me, it feels kind of like it was in the same exact position. I mean, I do understand that last format, you just had some games where it's like expulsion, auto win, you know what I mean? And you're not going to get that anymore. But everything else that the deck could do, all the plays with like Quim reviving Mirror Jade, which I think is like nuts, or reviving an Albaz during the battle phase on your opponent's turn to make a Mirror Jade with their extra deck monsters, like all the stuff that it could do before, because it literally has 12 sets of support. Like, it's all still there. It just, you no longer get the auto win cheese cards. Now you do have to actually play some games. I think in games where you don't get your branded fusion Ash, I think this deck's snowball potential is probably it's like one of the highest in Yu-Gi-Oh! Like, seriously, if you don't get Ash and your branded fusion just like rides, like, you just get so many pluses, you almost don't know what to do with them. So yeah, I feel like it's a 1.5 deck.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a deck that a lot of people are still going to play, I'm sure. Just, it's solid. Looking at the next one here, though, Goldpunk Pride. How do you feel about this deck?
Oh my goodness. So, Gold Punk Pride. This is actually one of like my biggest pet decks, and I wanted it to be good so bad last format, but Droll and Gamma were just like they made it impossible to like get good results out of this deck. However, with those cards not, gonna be as popular, you can still play Gamma if you want, but with those cards kind of taking a back seat, I think this deck is like really solid. If you haven't seen some of the combos, like, there are combos where you can play through Nib. Your disruptions can be layered because some of them come in the form of monsters. You can search things like Ghost Ogre with the Punk, Jam Dragon. You can get the trap card with Carry. So like, your disruptions are kind of stacked. I feel like it's kind of like tier 2. I mean, I think it's to be honest, I think it's significantly better than like Purrely and Samurai. The only thing that you have to worry about is sometimes it can be a little Z Almond or bust. Like, if Z Almond gets interrupted, sometimes you can kind of struggle.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that tier 2 is where this deck has stayed for a while, but, one day it will get its time in the spotlight. That's one thing I always keep in the back of my mind, though, is just like, that is a deck, and if you run into it, be prepared for it, so...
I mean, more than likely they're gonna get an OCG card when the OCG gets that. When they eventually get gold pride. So, and also there could just be a third wave of support. So we don't know.
So this next one being Melffy Sprite, I feel like this has been pretty popular overall. It's been a very solid deck, put up a lot of numbers. I think that if I was going to play a Sprite deck, again, it's probably still just Live Twin Runick Sprite. I think that the Melffy deck, though, has a lot of potential, has a lot of ways to play. For me, it'd be between 1.5 and 2. I think that it could go in either category, honestly. I think the power level's still there. For me, I'd put it in 2, though, because I don't really love the Melffy engine. I think that it's solid. Like, Caddy and Napini going to, like, Herald the Arclight is pretty solid. But overall, I think that there's just such a better build, and this, I feel like, lacks a lot of what the other deck can do. Because even in the other deck, too, like playing like Live Twin, you can even play cards like Droplet, which are really solid in that deck, because you go like normal summon 1 effect, and then they go any interruption, you chain Droplet, get rid of it, summon the other one effect, summon out the other one from deck. So there's like so many different things that you can do in different interactions that I feel like are just overall much better. But I'd probably put Melffy Sprite in tier 2.
So yeah, that's probably where I'm feeling. I gotta be honest, I am not a big fan of this deck. I tried it a bunch last format. I absolutely hated it. Although I think that last format between Gamma and Ogre being so popular, I feel like it was just such a bad position for the sprite cards, specifically like Gigantic. I think this deck is in a better position, but not because it got better, just because things got worse and because those hand traps might not be as popular anymore. I don't like the fact that these Melffy cards kind of feel like bricks, but I do understand like its inboard is deceptively strong because it doesn't really look all that good, but then you realize like, oh, you get a bounce. And then you can go into like Herald of the Arclights, and then you have the Melffy cards summoning themselves, and you can, target monsters, negate their effects, make it so they can't attack. Like it does more than you would think. I don't think that the like crackback is very strong or the follow-up's very strong, but usually you don't really need it to be because you've disrupted your opponent. So I'm not a fan of the deck, but I feel like it's in a much better position than it was before.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I'm not really either. I prefer the other variant of Sprite. I think that's just inherently better. Talking about a deck, though, that you've definitely played for a while. Looking at Eldlich here with a lot of floodgates. I think, honestly, this would just fall into Rogue.
Okay, so this is gonna probably stun everyone, but I'm going to be as objective and honest as possible. I would put Eldlich in Wouldn't Play, and even though I did literally just play this at YCS Philly, made day 2 and everything, was 1 win away from making top 64, it's about the matchups. And if you have these decks that are moving in, that are going to be about a heavy spell lineup, that's not good for Eldlich. Eldlich is not good, and generally, a lot of these trap decks are not like super good if you're relying on floodgates against like Runick, because the Runick cards can pop your floodgates with like they can pop it with destruction, and then they can draw cards, and you really don't have like a great way of interacting with them. And I feel like you want more kind of mono decks. Like last format, TC could go insane against Samurai or insane against Purrely. It was like a 1-card win. And those decks are probably going to be taking big steps back. So like some of your positive matches or matchups are falling out of the meta, and they're being replaced by like Striker and Runick, where the Eldritch cards aren't that good against them. Skill Drain can still crush everything, but right now I don't like Eldritch's position. It's not about like Eldritch itself. It's more about like the matchups. And right now I would not play Eldritch because I don't like the matchups right now.
So I can definitely understand where you're coming from on that. There's a lot of different things that happen during a format that you can see decks like Eldritch top here and there too. I did hear about it doing really well at a tournament not too long ago.
It did well. I think 2 players made top 64 at Philly. Well, Eldritch.
Yeah, and so like even just from like a standpoint of like, yeah, some of the matchups can be bad. I don't think that it's even like the worst option if you pull up with it, because I feel like a lot of people won't expect it. And I think that's something too that is like pretty solid. You do have to think about your rounds 5 to 9 and not 1 to 4 though. So I could definitely understand that mentality to say like, I probably wouldn't play this deck right now. It's definitely an interesting one. I feel like it's something that you always kind of keep in the back of your mind because there's a lot of different ways you can play it. Come to think about it now, though, if people are on Ash and Bell, it's probably really unfortunate for Eldritch at the moment.
Yeah, Bell coming back into the meta is actually like terrible because At Philly, I don't think I got belled one time in 12 rounds, but like that would help. That would happen a lot more. And it's not just bell on Sanguine, but you can bell Golden Lord's effect to like try to move himself from the graveyard, and you can even bell Wakero.
So the next one here, I get so many comments about this deck when I leave it off a tier list. I get so many comments, and I'm gonna leave it on this one, and I'm just gonna put it where I believe that this deck probably should be. And
What?
I don't like this deck at all. I think that it loses to way too many cards. I think that, like we were talking about earlier, Evenly is going to be very popular in this format because it's a very good card. And I feel like some of the boards, it's just like one Evenly and it's cooked. But I just personally, I really don't like this deck. I don't think it's very good. I don't think that the power level is very high. But where would you put this deck?
Probably in the same spot. It's honestly it's like a worse version, like a way worse version of Rika, because you're playing a bunch of plants and stuff like that, and you're trying to like use some tactics to like play around Nib. This deck can make like Rafflesia and have a trap hole to like stop Nib and stuff like that. I think the payoff just like isn't there. The payoff is not high enough. And these trap hole cards, they're okay against cash because like a floodgate, you can book a monster and it's just like, oh, you don't have birth, cool, your turn's over. But I think a lot of the matchups are like I think it into these spell decks is just going to be a nightmare, and even something like the live twin cards, I think that would be very difficult for you to disrupt. Because like you normal summon like Leela, and if you have a floodgate trap hole, cool, but I still get to like summon a monster, and if I have sprite cards, I just keep on playing. Yeah, right now I think it's just like a bad time for Traptrix. I'm not exactly sure what the meta is going to need to be for them to move higher, but like this just ain't it. It's just that simple. This ain't the meta for you.
Yeah, absolutely not. And the last deck that we saved, it's definitely a huge conversation between me and Cap. We both talk about this deck quite often. This is something that I have a gripe with because there was two cards that could have been Vanquish Souls that are not Vanquish Souls. The Link 1 and Stake Your Soul are both not quote-unquote Vanquish Souls, so you can't like tag out the Link 1, you can't search Stake. And for me, that's very unfortunate. But I think that the deck overall, as we were talking about it earlier, I think that just respecting it as what it is, just being like a mid-range deck, that's not supposed to do like crazy things, but it doesn't do like nothing, right? So I definitely think that if I were to put this anywhere, even with talking about the fact that I just got like second, right? I think that I would put this in tier 2. Where would you put this?
We're going higher. Tier 1.5. I think Vanquish Soul is very strong. I think that there are people who like if you read the card, the archetype is not like it's too nuanced to really understand how strong some of the boards can be, even when they don't appear strong, right? Like there are certain games where if you just get Ryzen, which is the card right there that you have in the silhouette, right? Like you just resolve Ryzen and that's just good enough. Ryzen gets you like to Burger, and then you special summon Burger and you draw a card, and you get to like Mad Love, and then you're drawing another card on your opponent's during your opponent's draw phase. The deck can play a lot of hand traps, just like Mathmech used to do with like Heat Soul. You can draw those hand traps during your opponent's turn. I love the fact that things like Kashtira Fenrir are insane in the deck because it's a good going first or second card. In addition to that, when you add like another copy of Fenrir, it's just not a dead card sitting in your hand doing nothing. It becomes an earth monster for you to reveal for some of your versus monsters effects. Even when the deck does play like these really high power cards that are only good going first or second, like if you have Kurikara, right? Fire Monster, or some of the Kaijus, Dogaran, Kumongus. These are cards that are only good going first, but then again, you can like small world bridge them to starters like Ryzen, or you can small world bridge those into hand traps. I think that the deck is very solid. For the most part, you don't get nibbed, and even the disruption, it just feels good enough. And one of the best things about the deck is it feels very similar to Salamangreat, where if a couple of the key cards can stay on the field, like if you can just keep Rock of Vanquisher alive, it's just good. Same thing with Burger. they're just going to give you resources every single game. It becomes so hard for you to lose if Burger just lives through your opponent's turn, because at that point you've drawn 3 cards, 4 cards by the time it gets back to them. And GG, like, name me a deck that loses when you just give it 4 cards. If you just, I mean, for free, the deck does burn damage for some weird reason. I think it has so many things going for it. I think that people just sleep on it because the ceiling of the deck is not that high. But we've seen decks like Salamangreat, where the ceiling's not that high, win YCS championships. I think Vanquish Soul is like incredible. I think it's a tier 1.5 deck.
I think that once we see more support with the deck, that maybe it'll change my mind.
I'm gonna say this. At that point, I feel like, because I think that the deck is like, the fact that it's only been legal per se for like a weekend, and we already saw it get second place at a nationals. Like, granted, you can say, oh, it snuck up on people, and I do think TC Boo was way better last format than it is like moving forward. But once it gets new support, I feel pretty confident like there won't be a tier 1.5 at that point, like, because it's probably gonna get 3 cards. At that point, it might just make the jump to like tier 1. If those 3 cards are all good, like look out. I mean, you've seen these deck building archetypes. Konami, I don't think it's in them to just release a pack where all 3 of the archetypes are just okay. Usually there's a Prank Kids or a Sky Striker. Usually one of them is like definitively the meta one.
I think VS is going to be very popular going into Nats. I think that a lot of people are going to try to play this deck.
For anyone who hasn't played it, it's not the easiest deck to play, because like you constantly have to be concerned about, what do I have in my hands? You know what I mean? Like, the difference between having Caesar Valius and having his 3 attributes, effect or not having, like, is a major difference. It can be the difference between you winning or losing a game. Like, having that extra, having that Papa, that non-targeting like destruction. It's a lot to think about when you play the deck. So it's not easy. It's not like super easy, but we will see. I believe in the deck. If you put it in tier 2, that's fine. Because again, I debate that Sky Striker I think Sky Striker is better than Branded right now.
That's fair. That is fair. I think that there's definitely a lot here to break down, so definitely let us know what you think about all this down in the comments below. I appreciate you joining me today, Cap. Overall, I think that we're in a really good spot in the format. I kind of like the format a lot right now. I think that this is better than last format, at least. So we'll definitely have to see. Any final thoughts on the tier list, though?
No, I think it's solid, and I echo your thoughts of where the format is right now, because I don't really think I feel like last format was a format where there were so many games where, like, if you didn't have a draw or a gamma, you actually could just like be in a position where you don't get to play the game. Like, you're either getting zone locked or SHS is making this gigantic board. But now I feel like you're in a position where like the decks do a lot less, and it makes the games a lot more fun, whether you're going second and maybe you don't open up with the best hand traps. So I like the meta more.
Absolutely. And again, if you haven't already checked out Megacaptialg's socials, I'll leave them down below: YouTube, Twitch, Twitter. So definitely go ahead and check him out as well. Thank you so much for joining me today. I love doing these tier lists. They're a lot of fun, especially in a new format. But I hope that everyone has a wonderful night, and we'll catch you in the next video. Thank you.